You see one table, you see another table. They look different. Different wood, different sizes, different makers. But you know instantly that both are tables. How? What lets your mind recognize tableness when every single table is unique? This question sounds simple. It destroyed entire belief systems, and the man who answered it changed how we think about literally everything. Athens, 428 BCE, maybe 427. Birth records blur, but the child born to Ariston and Perictione came from power. His mother's line traced back to Solon, the lawgiver who built Athenian democracy. His father's side claimed descent from Poseidon himself. The family owned property. They moved in circles where politics wasn't discussed. It was lived. The boy should have entered government. Every sign pointed that direction. Instead, he met a man who asked questions nobody could answer. If you value documented philosophy and intellectual history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, published February 2003, to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, detailing Phaedo and Middle Period dialogues, and Plato's actual dialogues preserved through 2,000 years, including the Phaedo dated to 399 BCE. These aren't generic academic references. These are primary texts and specialized academic databases tracking every surviving fragment of ancient Greek philosophy. Now back to the information. Athens was bleeding. The Peloponnesian War turned the Golden City into a graveyard. Plague hit in 430. It came back in 428. Pericles died. Democracy buckled. The young Plato grew up watching Sparta choke his city. 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. Sparta installed 30 men to rule. They called them archons. History called them the 30 tyrants. 2 of them were Plato's relatives. Critias, his mother's cousin. Charmides, his mother's brother. They wanted Plato with them. He was 24 years old. Connected family, sharp mind, perfect recruit. They sent for him. He declined. Then he watched them terrorize Athens. They executed 1,400 people without trial. They tried to implicate a philosopher named Socrates in their crimes. Ordered him to arrest Leon of Salamis for execution. Socrates refused. The tyrants fell after 8 months. Democracy returned in 403. But it came back angry. 401 War. The restored Democrats raided Eleusis, killed the remaining oligarchs. Athens was fractured. Trust was gone, and Plato was disgusted. Before the tyranny, before the collapse, he'd found Socrates. The meeting might have happened in the Palaestra Gymnasium. It might have been in the Agora. The stories conflict. What doesn't conflict is what Socrates did. He asked questions. Not rhetorical flourishes, not speeches. Questions that cornered you. What is courage? Define it. You give an answer. He finds the hole. He pushes. Your definition contradicts something else you believe. So which is it? You revise. He pushes again. You're a knot tying itself tighter. This was the Socratic method, Elenchus. And it worked because Socrates wasn't performing. He claimed he knew nothing. He meant it. The oracle at Delphi supposedly called him the wisest man in Athens. His response was that he was wise only because he knew nothing. Everyone else thought they knew. Plato watched this. He watched Socrates humiliate the powerful by just asking them to define the words they used. Justice, piety, virtue, friendship. Nobody could do it. Their definitions collapsed into contradiction every time. Socrates made enemies. He made enemies by the dozen. 399 BCE, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon brought charges. Impiety, corrupting the youth. The trial was held in the Agora. 500 jurors, maybe 501, farmers, craftsmen, citizens over 30, chosen by lot. The prosecution had 3 hours by water clock. No record of their argument survives. The defense survives because Plato wrote it down. Socrates didn't beg. He didn't apologize. He told the jury they were wrong. He compared himself to a gadfly stinging a lazy horse. Athens needed him. They should be giving him free meals for life, not execution. The vote came 280 for conviction, 221 against, 30 votes different, and he walks free. Then came sentencing. Socrates had to propose an alternative. He suggested the free meals. The jury voted again, 360 for death, 140 against. More voted to kill him than voted to convict him. He'd antagonized them in his own defense. He was 70 years old. The method was hemlock, poison distilled from a plant, Conium maculatum. It produces gradual paralysis of the central nervous system. You stay conscious while your body shuts down from the extremities inward. Athens used it because you could drink it. The condemned executed themselves. Socrates spent his last day in prison. His friends visited. They offered escape. The prison wasn't heavily guarded. They had money. They had a plan. He refused. He'd spent his life telling Athenians to obey the law. To break it now would be hypocrisy. His wife Xanthippe came with their 3 sons. The youngest was maybe 3 years old. She became distressed. Socrates asked them to take her away. Then he talked philosophy until the jailer brought the cup. He drank it, walked until his legs went numb, lay down. The coldness spread upward through his body. His last words were about a debt. Crito? We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt. Minutes later, he was dead. Plato wasn't there. Ancient sources say he was ill, but he wrote the scene, the Phaedo, every detail, the prison, the conversation, the hemlock, the death. Plato left Athens. He stayed away for maybe 10 years. He went to Megara first, stayed with Euclides, another Socratic. He might have visited Egypt, might have gone to Cyrene in North Africa. The evidence is thin. What's certain is he went to southern Italy and Sicily around 388. 387 BCE. He was roughly 40 years old. In Italy, he encountered the Pythagoreans. This mattered. The Pythagoreans taught that reality had a mathematical structure. Numbers weren't just tools, they were the foundation of existence. Pythagoras had died a century earlier, but his followers maintained his teachings. They believed in the immortality of the soul. They practiced strict communal living. They saw geometry as sacred. Plato met Archytas of Tarentum, a Pythagorean philosopher and mathematician. He likely met others in Phlius, maybe including the philosopher Eschycrates. These encounters left marks all over his later work. In Sicily, he met Dion, the brother-in-law of Dionysius I, tyrant of Syracuse. Plato tried to advise Dionysius on philosophy and governance. It went badly. Later stories claim Dionysius got annoyed and sold Plato into slavery. These stories are probably fiction. What's real is that Plato returned to Athens around 387 with Pythagorean mathematics lodged in his skull and Socrates dead in his memory. He bought property near a grove of olive trees sacred to the hero Academus, about 1.5 kilometers northwest of the Dippolon Gates, outside the city walls. He started teaching there, started gathering students. The gatherings became structured, became the academy. Founded around 387 BCE, maybe 386, it lasted in some form until 529 CE, when the Christian emperor Justinian shut it down. 900 years of continuous philosophical instruction. The academy was the Western world's first university. It wasn't a building, it was a community of inquiry. No tuition fees during Plato's lifetime. You came because you wanted to learn. You stayed because the dialogue mattered. The curriculum included mathematics, astronomy, physics, philosophy. Students debated, teachers lectured. They used the Socratic method. Questions over answers, dialectic over dogma. And in this space, surrounded by students arguing about knowledge and reality, Plato started writing the middle dialogues. The early dialogues had been about Socrates. They asked ethical questions. What is piety? What is courage? They ended in aporia, in puzzle states where no answer holds. The middle dialogues went further. The Phaedo came probably first. It's set in 399 BCE, Socrates' last day, but written years later, maybe in the 370s BCE. The Phaedo does something the early dialogues never did. It proposes answers, big answers, about the soul, about immortality, about the nature of reality itself. And buried in those proposals is the theory of forms. Here's the problem. Plato inherited. Heraclitus of Ephesus, active around 500 BCE, taught that everything flows. Panta rei. You can't step in the same river twice. Different water flows past. The river changes. You change. Change is the only constant. Reality is flux. Heraclitus wrote in fragments, cryptic and oracular. The way up and the way down is the same. Nature loves to hide. Fire lives the death of earth, and air lives the death of fire. His philosophy made change fundamental. Nothing persists. Stability is illusion. Parmenides of Elea, born around 515 BCE, said the exact opposite. Change is impossible. Reality is one, unchanging, indivisible, eternal. To say something changes means it goes from being to not being, but not being can't exist. You can't think about nothing. You can't speak about nothing. Therefore, change is logically incoherent. Motion is impossible. Plurality is impossible. What is, simply is. Parmenides wrote a philosophical poem, The Way of Truth, The Way of Opinion. Truth tells you reality is a perfect, unchanging sphere. Opinion tells you the world you see with your senses. Opinion is wrong. Your senses deceive you. Only reason reveals reality. This was the trap. Heraclitus says everything changes. Parmenides says nothing changes. Both can't be right. The visible world obviously changes. Seasons shift. Bodies age. Cities rise and fall. But if reality is only change, how do we have any stable knowledge? How do we define anything? If reality is unchanging, why does the world look like it changes? How do you explain motion, birth, death, diversity? The pre-Socratic philosophers had backed themselves into a corner, and Plato was standing in that corner holding a dead teacher's legacy. Socrates had asked for definitions. What is justice? What is beauty? He wanted accounts that held across all cases, not examples, principles. When you define justice, you're not listing just actions. You're identifying what makes those actions just, the principle behind them, the form they share. Socrates never said these principles existed independently. He just assumed we could discover them through dialectic. Plato took it further. What if the principles Socrates searched for weren't just concepts in our minds? What if they were real? Real in a way that transcends the physical world? What if when you recognize tableness across different tables, you're recognizing something that exists beyond any individual table? An eternal, unchanging, perfect table? The form of table? And what if there are forms for everything? The form of beauty? The form of justice? The form of the good? This is the theory of forms. Sometimes called the theory of ideas. The Greek word is eidos, sometimes idea. Both mean the same thing. Forms are abstract, perfect, eternal essences. They exist in a realm beyond the physical. Physical objects participate in forms. A beautiful painting participates in the form of beauty. A just action participates in the form of justice. Physical things are imperfect copies. They change, decay, die. Forms never change. They're timeless, perfect, knowable. In the Phaedo, Plato argues this through Socrates' voice. 4 arguments for the soul's immortality, but threaded through the arguments is the doctrine of forms. At 72e through 78be, Socrates discusses recollection. Learning is remembering. The soul exists before birth. It knew the forms before it entered the body. When you see 2 equal sticks, you recognize equality. But physical equality is always imperfect. The sticks are nearly equal, not perfectly equal. Your recognition of equality must come from knowledge of perfect equality itself, the form. You couldn't recognize imperfect copies unless you knew the perfect original. Therefore, you knew the forms before birth. Therefore, your soul pre-exists. At 78b through 84be, the affinity argument, the soul is like the forms, invisible, unchanging, immortal. The body is like physical things, visible, changing, mortal. After death, the soul returns to what it resembles. It goes to the realm of forms. The theory of forms solves the Heraclitus-Parmenides problem. Physical objects change. They flow like Heraclitus said, but forms don't change. They're eternal and unchanging, like Parmenides said. Both philosophers were partly right. The sensory world changes. The intelligible world, the world of forms, doesn't. Knowledge is possible because we can know the forms through reason. Sensory perception gives us unreliable opinions about physical things. Rational thought gives us knowledge of forms. This split between the sensory and the intelligible becomes foundational to Western philosophy. Plato developed this theory through the Middle Dialogues, the Symposium. Probably written after the Phaedo but before the Republic. It's set at a drinking party in 416 BCE. The characters give speeches praising love. Socrates reports a conversation with Diotima, a priestess. She describes a ladder of love. You start by loving a beautiful body. Then you realize there are many beautiful bodies. You love physical beauty in general. Then you realize beauty exists in souls, in laws, in knowledge. You climb higher. Finally, you reach the form of beauty itself. Perfect, eternal, unchanging, not tied to any body or action. Beauty itself. The allegory of the cave comes in the Republic. Probably written mid to late 370s BCE. Book 7. Picture prisoners chained in a cave since childhood. They face a wall. Behind them a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects. The fire casts shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only shadows. They think the shadows are reality. One prisoner breaks free, turns around, sees the fire and the objects. Painful at first. The light hurts, but he adjusts. Then he's dragged up out of the cave into sunlight. Blinded again. Eventually he sees the real world. Trees, sky, the sun itself. The sun represents the form of the good, the highest form, the source of all knowledge and truth. The shadows are the physical world. The real objects are the forms. The prisoner who escapes is the philosopher. The one who turns from sensory illusion to rational truth. The Republic lays out how a just city should function. The ideal state is ruled by philosopher kings. Why? Because philosophers know the forms. They've seen the good, they can govern according to truth, not opinion. Regular people live in the cave. They see shadows. They fight over shadows. Philosophers have left the cave. They know what's real. They should rule. Plato's not being metaphorical. He means this. The forms are real. Knowledge of them is real. And philosophers have that knowledge. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Plato never gives a systematic explanation of the forms. No dialogue says, here's the complete doctrine. You reconstruct it from scattered passages across multiple dialogues. Scholars debate details constantly, but the core is clear. Forms exist independently of physical objects. Physical objects participate in forms or imitate them. Forms are perfect. Objects are imperfect copies. Forms are eternal. Objects are temporary. Forms are known by reason. Objects are perceived by senses. Forms are the true reality. Objects are less real, maybe even unreal. How does participation work? Plato uses two explanations. Methexis, participation. The particular object participates in the form. Mimesis, imitation. The particular object imitates the form like a copy. Both explanations appear in the Parmenides dialogue, written later, maybe in the 360s BCE, in the Parmenides. An old Parmenides and his student Zeno visit Athens. They meet a young Socrates. Parmenides questions Socrates about the forms. He tears the theory apart. If a form is one thing and many things participate in it, does each thing get a piece of the form? Then the form is divided. But forms are supposed to be indivisible, or maybe the whole form is present in each thing. Then one thing is in many places at once. Neither option works. The third man argument. You have many large things. They participate in the form of largeness. But now you have a collection. The many large things plus largeness itself. What makes this collection large? You need another form above it, and another above that. Infinite regress. These objections are serious. Plato knows they're serious. The Parmenides isn't Plato giving up on the forms. It's Plato refining them. Later dialogues show a more sophisticated theory. The sophist, probably written after Parmenides, distinguishes different kinds of predication. They're saying something has a property, and they're saying something is that property in its essence. This distinction helps. The Timaeus, one of Plato's later works, describes a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who shapes physical reality using the forms as templates. The demiurge looks at the eternal forms and molds the physical world to resemble them as closely as matter allows. The physical world becomes a moving image of eternity. But back to the core question, why did Plato need the forms? Because of Socrates. Socrates asked for definitions. Universal definitions that explain what makes a thing what it is. If you define justice as giving people what they're owed, you're identifying a principle. That principle has to be the same across all cultures and times. If justice is relative, if it changes with opinion, then Socrates' question has no answer. But Socrates thought it had an answer. He thought you could discover it. So did Plato. The answer couldn't be in the physical world. Physical things change. They're contingent. They come and go. The definition of justice can't change with them. It has to be stable, eternal, accessible to reason. It has to be a form. The forms also solve the problem of knowledge. If everything changes, like Heraclitus says, knowledge is impossible. You can't know what won't hold still. But if there are unchanging essences behind the flux, you can know those. You can't have stable knowledge of physical objects because they change. But you can have stable knowledge of forms because they don't change. The forms make knowledge possible, and they explain unity and diversity. You see 1,000 different triangles, different sizes, materials, colors. But they're all triangles. How? You recognize the form of triangle in each. The form is what they have in common. It's not in any specific triangle. It's separate, abstract, perfect. A perfect triangle has angles that sum exactly to 180 degrees. No physical triangle does. Physical lines have width. Physical angles are imprecise, but you understand perfect triangularity anyway, because you know the form. The mathematical emphasis comes from the Pythagoreans. Numbers are abstract. The number 3 doesn't exist in space and time like a rock does. You can't see 3. You can see 3 rocks. But 3 itself is a concept, an abstraction, and yet it's real. Mathematical truths are eternal. 2 plus 2 equals 4 in ancient Greece and in 21st century Earth and everywhere. Mathematics gave Plato a model for the forms. If numbers can be real and abstract and eternal, why not justice and beauty and goodness? Plato taught this at the Academy. Aristotle arrived in 367 BCE when he was 17. He studied there for 20 years. Aristotle would eventually break from Plato's theory. He rejected separately existing forms. He thought forms exist in objects, not in a separate realm. He thought Plato duplicated reality unnecessarily. Why have a perfect triangle and imperfect triangles? Why not just triangles? Aristotle's criticism forced later Platonists to refine the theory. But Aristotle's own philosophy is still shaped by Plato's questions. What makes a thing what it is? What's the essence of it? Aristotle's forms are immanent in objects. Plato's forms are transcendent, beyond objects. But both are asking the same question Socrates asked. What is it? Define it. Plato went to Sicily twice more. 367 and 361 BCE. Both trips were disasters. Dionysius II became tyrant of Syracuse. Dion convinced Plato to come train him, make him a philosopher king. It failed. Dionysius exiled Dion. Plato became essentially a hostage. He escaped. Went back. Failed again. Dion eventually returned to Syracuse with an army. He ruled briefly. Then he was assassinated. Plato gave up on Syracuse, gave up on finding a philosopher king in his lifetime. He focused on the academy. The late dialogues become more technical, less literary. The Laws is the longest dialogue. It describes a second-best city, one that doesn't need philosopher kings because it has good laws. The Philebus discusses pleasure and knowledge. The Sophist and Statesman refine earlier ideas. The late dialogues suggest Plato kept working on the forms until his death, kept adjusting, kept refining, trying to answer objections, trying to make the theory hold. He died in 348 or 347 BCE. Ancient sources say he was at a wedding feast. They say he was 80 or 81. Other calculations say 84. He was buried at the academy or near it. The school continued. His nephew Speusippus took over, then others. The academy went through phases: Old Academy, Middle Academy, New Academy. Eventually it was destroyed in 86 BCE when the Roman general Sulla sacked Athens. Later, Neoplatonists revived it in the 5th century CE. It lasted until Justinian closed it, but Plato's influence didn't need the building. The theory of forms shaped everything that came after. Early Christian theology used Platonic ideas. Augustine read the Platonists before he read the Bible. The forms became God's thoughts, perfect, eternal ideas in the divine mind. The physical world became a pale reflection of divine perfection. Medieval scholastics debated universals for centuries. Do categories exist independently or only in the mind? Realism versus nominalism. The debate is Plato's forms under different names. Descartes, in the 17th century, distinguished mind and body. Eternal truths versus contingent matter. The split echoes. Plato's forms versus physical objects. Kant, in the 18th century, distinguished phenomena from noumena, things as they appear versus things as they are. He's working in a framework Plato built. Even modern analytic philosophy argues about abstract objects. Do numbers exist? Do properties exist independently of the things that have them? These are questions about forms. But Plato's real achievement wasn't just the theory, it was the move he made. Socrates asked questions. Plato built a system. He said the invisible is more real than the visible. He said reason is more reliable than senses. He said abstract truths are eternal and physical things are temporary shadows. This is a radical claim. Most people think what you see is real and ideas are just in your head. Plato reversed it. Ideas are real. What you see is an imperfect copy. The reversal created Western metaphysics. It created the idea that there's a true reality behind appearances. That philosophy's job is to discover that reality through reason, that the world you see isn't the world that is. Plato never proved the forms exist. He argued for them. He built elaborate metaphors. He pointed to mathematics. He showed how they solve problems. But he never proved them like you prove a theorem. The theory of forms is a hypothesis. Plato himself calls it that in the Phaedo. An assumption you build on until you find a first principle that justifies it or destroys it. He spent his life building on it, refining it, testing it against objections. He didn't finish. Aristotle left the academy and criticized it. The Stoics rejected it. The skeptics doubted it. But it never went away. You can see why. The question that started it remains. You see one table and another table, and you know they're both tables. How? What is tableness? Where is it? If it's just in your mind, why do you and I agree that both are tables? If it's in the objects, which part of the table is the tableness? The wood? The shape? The function? None of those are tableness itself. They're just instances. Plato says tableness is a form. an eternal, abstract, perfect template that physical tables approximate. You can reject that answer, you can say it's unnecessary, you can offer alternatives, but you can't ignore the question. And every alternative answer is arguing with Plato. The forms explain something else, too. They explain why learning feels like recognition. You study geometry, you see a proof, suddenly it clicks. You don't feel like you learned something new? You feel like you remembered something you'd always known. Plato would say you did. Your soul knew geometry before birth. It knew the forms. The body made you forget. Education is recollection, removing the forgetting, turning the soul back toward what it already knows. Plato tells a myth in the Phaedrus about souls before birth. They travel in the train of the gods, circling the heavens. At the top of their orbit, they glimpse the realm of forms, pure being, perfect truth. Then they fall to earth, get trapped in bodies, forget what they saw. But the memory lingers. When you see beauty in a face or wisdom in a teaching, you're remembering the forms. You're recognizing an echo of what you saw before birth. The longing for wisdom is the soul's longing to return home, to escape the body and rejoin the forms. This is why philosophers don't fear death. Death frees the soul from the body's prison. The soul returns to the forms. Socrates drank the hemlock calmly because he believed this. Plato wrote the Phaedo to explain why. The academy trained students in mathematics first. There's a probably apocryphal story about a sign over the entrance, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Whether the sign existed or not, the principle was real. Mathematics is pure abstraction. Studying it trains you to think about things that aren't physical. Once you can reason about numbers and shapes, you can reason about justice and beauty and the good. The philosopher starts with sensory things, moves to mathematics, then to dialectic, pure philosophical reasoning about the forms themselves. The training takes years, decades. Most people can't do it. They stay in the cave watching shadows. But some can, and those who can should rule. The Republic describes the education of guardians. They start young. Music and gymnastics for harmony of soul and body, then mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmonics. Each discipline abstracts further from the physical. Astronomy isn't about visible stars. It's about the mathematical patterns they approximate. You study the perfect circles and ratios, not the actual messy sky. At 35, after years of mathematics, the guardians begin dialectic. They study the forms directly. 5 years of that. At 40, they're ready. They've seen the good. Now they must descend back into the cave. They must rule the city. They don't want to. They've seen the truth. Why go back to shadows? But they must. They owe the city. The city educated them. They return and rule justly because they know what justice is. They've seen the form. No city ever implemented this. Plato tried with Dionysius and failed, but the idea persists. Rule by those who know. Government based on truth, not opinion. Expertise over popularity. It's anti-democratic. Plato knew that. He'd seen democracy execute Socrates. Democracy is rule by the mob. The mob doesn't know the forms. They know opinions. Opinions conflict. Opinions change. Truth doesn't. Let the knowers rule. Critics have attacked this for centuries. Who decides who knows? The knowers. Who checks their power? Nobody. They've seen the good. They can't be wrong. It's a recipe for tyranny. Plato would say no. Philosopher kings don't want power. They want truth. They rule reluctantly, out of duty. But history shows that people who claim to know absolute truth and demand absolute power tend not to be reluctant or benevolent. The theory of forms enables authoritarianism if you're not careful. If you believe you know the truth and others don't, you can justify forcing your truth on them for their own good because you know the good itself. Plato probably didn't see it that way. He saw a world where Socrates died for asking questions, where Athens tore itself apart, where sophists sold persuasion to whoever paid, where politicians pursued power and crowds followed passion. He wanted a world ruled by reason, by knowledge, by people who loved truth more than victory. The forms were his answer. They grounded ethics. They made knowledge possible. They explained the universe. In 348 BCE, Plato died. His theory had problems. The Parmenides exposed them. Later thinkers would argue endlessly about participation, imitation, the third man argument. The theory was incomplete, but the project was clear. Behind the changing, visible world, there's an unchanging, intelligible world. Physical objects are imperfect copies of perfect forms. Knowledge is possible because the forms are knowable. Ethics is objective because there's a form of the good. The soul is immortal because it belongs to the realm of forms. Philosophy is the ascent from shadow to truth, from opinion to knowledge, from the cave into the light. Aristotle criticized it. The Stoics modified it. The skeptics doubted it. The Neoplatonists revived it. Christians baptized it. Islamic philosophers adapted it. Aquinas synthesized it with Aristotelian hylomorphism. Descartes echoed it. Kant transformed it. Hegel internalized it. Analytic philosophers still argue about universals and abstract objects. Metaphysicians still debate what it means for something to exist. Epistemologists still ask how knowledge is possible. Ethicists still ask if values are objective. Every one of these questions traces back to Plato's theory of forms. In a clay jar in Herculaneum, buried by Vesuvius, scholars found carbonized papyrus scrolls. Some contain fragments of Plato's lost lectures, not the dialogues, the actual oral teachings at the Academy. They're burned, fragile, barely readable. New imaging techniques are revealing words. Lecture on the good, something about the one, about unity and multiplicity, the forms again. Different angles, more technical. Plato kept working on it, kept pushing the theory in his lectures while he published the dialogues. We may never read it all. The scrolls might crumble before we can image them, but what we've seen confirms it. Plato spent his life on this question. What makes a thing what it is? Where's the reality behind appearance? How can we know anything for certain? The answer he gave changed everything, not because it's right. Nobody knows if it's right. But because asking whether it's right forced every philosopher after him to articulate their own metaphysics, to say what they think reality is, to explain knowledge and existence and truth. Plato set the questions. The theory of forms is the hypothesis that launched 2,000 years of argument. And the argument continues, because the question remains, you look at two different tables and know they're both tables. How? What is tableness? Where is it? Is it real? If you say it's just a concept, just a word, just a pattern our brains recognize, you're arguing with Plato. You're proposing a different answer, but you're answering his question. 399 BCE, Socrates died asking, what is justice? Athens couldn't answer. 348 BCE, Plato died having proposed an answer. Justice is a form, an eternal, perfect, unchanging truth accessible to reason. You might not accept it, but you have to contend with it. Because before Plato, philosophy asked about the world you see. After Plato, philosophy asks about the world behind the world, the real behind the apparent, the eternal behind the temporary, the truth behind the shadow. Whether you're studying medieval theology or modern physics, whether you're analyzing language or building AI systems, you're working in a framework where invisible structures are more fundamental than visible objects, where mathematical abstractions explain physical phenomena, where concepts precede instances. The framework started with a man in Athens who asked how your mind recognizes tableness across different tables and concluded that tableness itself must be real, eternal, and perfect. The answer might be wrong, but the question broke open the universe,